slaying cunt. Is that the expression? Has that gotten here?
It depends on the circles you swim in.
It means that something is wonderful. All the Columbia kids are saying it.
Right.
And so, boy, am I getting the expression right? I'm almost sure I am. It slays cunt means that it's really cool. I learned that a year ago, and they're all saying it. So,
okay. Wow.
Well,
you slay cunt, John McWhorter. You definitely slay cunt. G'day, humans. Welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And what a treat getting to sit down with one of my intellectual heroes, the articulate, the courageous John McWhorter. He's a columnist for the New York Times. He's also probably the most famous living linguist. He teaches linguistics at Columbia University. He's written a ton of books, both about language and also about race. He is frequently sort of bête noire of both the left and also the right. The right hates him for being so opposed to Trump. The left hates him for apparently not being on board with every social justice maxim that he is supposed to mouth, being a black American. He hosts a delightful podcast called Lexicon Valley, which is about language. He also sort of semi-co-hosts The Glenn Show, which is Glenn Loury's podcast, another black academic, but someone who's much more conservative than John is, and listening to the two of them wrestle with issues of politics and culture, both large and small, is a total delight. I have cherished reading so many of John's books, both about language and also about race and the culture wars. I particularly recommend his recent and most courageous book called Woke Racism: How a New Religion Has Betrayed America. He's been published in every august publication that you can possibly think of, and I was delighted to see that he was scheduled to come to Sydney for a series of talks and events at the University of Sydney. While he was here, he was generous enough to stop by the Uncomfortable Conversations studios. Please enjoy him and me wrestling with Donald Trump, wokeness, social justice, and language. The one and only John McWhorter. It's about 70% male.
Yeah, that's the podcast thing.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's always like that.
Do you have a theory?
Most of the hosts are men, is I think a lot of it. And then the question is, why is that? Because guys like to play with gadgets, and that especially happened during the pandemic, I'm guessing. But if you get feedback from a podcast, it's usually a man. My linguistics podcast, for example, is not that way because linguistics tilts female. But if it's Glenn Loury and me, all men for the most part. Yeah.
But is that because of the content? Because the linguistics podcast is apolitical, intriguing. It stimulates the sort of nerdy, intellectual. Yeah, it's nerdy. Right. Your other podcast is, I suppose, red meat to a certain type of.
And we're battling against an orthodoxy, and so a lot of it is in a civilized way us saying "fuck this, fuck that."
Exactly.
Fuck that. And maybe that lends itself to a male sensibility, and so that might be part of it.
I'm skeptical about the gadget theory because I don't think that what's going on here is that we're playing with gadgets. I think it's got something to do with the kind of things that get said in a digital realm that the legacy media has not caught up with figuring out how to articulate yet.
So it's the professional, and I don't mean this in a cynical way, but the deliberate, willful contrarianism. You have something to say that you don't think is getting out there. That's fighting. That you've got boxing gloves on, I think.
That's the cynical version of the explanation. I think the generous version of the explanation is that the legacy media has been slow to keep up with the rambunctiousness of the public square in the past 10 years and feels staid and
in
safe.
A gender-neutral sense.
Yeah, exactly. And that the kind of the spirit of aliveness that you can sometimes get, the frisson of naughtiness maybe from a podcast, right? Yeah, is more appealing to men
because somehow? it's sparring. It's boom that. And you don't want to say it, but that is more male, I think. And it's not that there aren't very successful podcasts run by and listened to by women. Many women in my life say I'm listening to a podcast, but it seems that this kind, like what we're doing right here, men are going to listen to this more than women.
It is about 70% our audience. But hello to the 30% of ladies out there. We loves you. We loves you. Share it with your lady friends. But I also wonder, now that I haven't thought about this before, but just hearing myself talk out loud and hearing your thoughts, I wonder if the the skew of the safety of the legacy media over the past 10 years has been somewhat feminized. I mean, the nature of the orthodoxy
Yes.
has been to make conversations more polite, more inclusive.
You don't wish
less
to offend.
abrasive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you don't want to say it, but I think it's fairly clear, even from science, that women are more inclusively inclined in that way than men, probabilistically. And so that means the feminization, in a way, of CNN or NPR, as opposed to many alternatives that are now available. Yeah, I would say that.
I guess the way of proving or disproving or falsifying this is going to be if the current moment of sort of right-wing backlash exudes through the mainstream media. I mean, it won't come to the Times, but if like the viewership of One America News and Fox News becomes large enough, will you see a podcast, an alternative media pushback that is more polite and more intellectual?
Right.
And would that then appeal more to women?
Right. That's an
It may not. I mean, it may still not.
That's an interesting sci-fi scenario, but I actually think that there's now, this comes from how language works, path dependence in general. The notion of what a podcast is, how you sound like a podcast. There's a grammar that has settled in, a sense of how it's supposed to feel that might be impervious to outside influences. It might be that we just do it this way, in the same sense that, I don't know, in 1950, you knew that most of the credits of a movie were going to run at the front, not at the end the way they do now. Everybody just knew. There was no particular reason for it. That's what a movie was like. It may be that a podcast is the bro feeling, and it's just going to stay that way because that's how things often work. But we'll see. We'll see.
I mean, I should also acknowledge that at least in Australia, and I'm not sure if it's quite as big in the States, there's a massive business for female-led podcasts, which are sort of they're either heartfelt sort of human story interviews where you get to know public figures in a much more intimate way with a very
following
charming,
this person around, right?
Yeah, charismatic female host.
Yeah.
Not following them around. I mean, just an interview show, but like where the point is to dig deep and to be compassionate rather than to be provocative. And then there's also one style of very popular show, which is the provocative, usually sexy, politically aware young female who has a show that goes places that you couldn't in the legacy media. We're usually far left, usually very pro-Palestinian, usually big tits, and
And she's attractive.
Yeah, she's attractive. I'm not thinking of one particular person, but I could name 5 of them.
Yeah, I mean generically, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not sure what the equivalent of that is in the United States, but then, Josh, to tell you the truth, I do not listen to many podcasts, as in I only listen to one, and it's the nerdy and magnificent The Rest is History.
Oh, great.
With these 2 Brits, and you just learn everything about history.
Yeah.
That's the only one, and I've really tried. I've tried to listen to podcasts connecting to all of my interests. I guess I'm getting old. I want to read. I just can't get past it. So I might not know that all of this exists in the United States, too.
Do you listen to NPR?
I listen to NPR constantly.
Yeah. So why haven't podcasts push that aside?
Because I listen to NPR and that's enough of people talking. And then I just want to read a book. It's the weirdest thing. And I know I'm falling out of step with life. And I really respect that there are so many podcasts about so many things. Many people who never particularly like to read now read a lot in that they listen to a lot of podcasts. That's great. But I have a really hard time letting go of, for those of you who can't see me right now, I'm pantomiming reading a book. Do you read a book?
I do, and I love it because I stopped for a while during COVID. Yeah. I had small children. I had a very stressful job at the public broadcaster, our equivalent of NPR. And, we just moved to Australia from the States, and there was just a lot going on. And I think I had that psychological fraying that many of us felt in 2020 and 2021. Kind of,
and also the voice was a balm. You might have wanted to listen to more people instead of just reading on the page.
And I found my attention
span.
Yeah, no, my attention span short.
Huh.
I don't know if you noticed that
during that time.
Yeah. I couldn't follow the thread of things easily. I would have to reread the same half page of a book over and over again.
I remember that with when my kids were small, because you're never really sleeping and you're constantly preoccupied. No, I think my powers of concentration improved during COVID because there was just so much time to not do anything else. But I know what you mean when you find that you can't follow the thread of pages. That for me was just the fatigue of having tiny ones, which you were having too.
Yes. And are you reading mostly fiction or nonfiction?
I am a nonfiction guy, and I wish that weren't true, because it's one of those things like if you are said to be a drinker, what people mean is not that you're drinking juice. They mean alcohol. And if people say, well, do you read? I don't know why it's in that accent.
Only Elizabethan English people ask you this question.
Only them. But if somebody says, do you read? What they mean is fiction. They mean, are you reading, Chimamanda, etc. I read constantly, but it's almost always nonfiction. I probably read about 6 fiction books a year, and probably 3 of them are ancient. And so modern fiction, I am very weak. Although if modern is 2001, The Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks is a magnificent historical novel. But see, there you go. There's a hint of nonfiction in it.
I'm writing it down.
It's about plague in a small English town in the late 1600s. And as placid as that sounds, or as much as it sounds like I was reading it because of COVID, and it wasn't that. It was something somebody recommended before that. A magnificent story, beautifully told. That's the last fiction that I read. But then right now, I'm reading Barchester Towers by Trollope, because one must read some Trollope. And so you're looking at me like, why?
Must one.
Everybody says, oh, he's so good. And I thought, well, all right. So I read The Way We Live Now, which was one of the best books of that kind I ever read. Then I thought, I'm going to do one more Trollope. And apparently the second best one is Barchester Towers. But that means I'm not cool, because I'm supposed to be reading something probably by a woman, and it's deeper, something by Jessamine Ward or something, but I'm not. I'm reading Trollope. I apologize.
I will never forgive you for it. I've transitioned back to fiction intentionally, because I was reading a huge amount of nonfiction, because that's my normal go-to place, because I'm an ideas-y person.
And you managed to fix it?
Yeah, I fixed it. I made a commitment that for half an hour before going to bed each night, I would read fiction, because it does something different to your brain, I think.
It's a completely different thing than reading nonfiction. Yeah. Every night before bed.
Yeah.
Not a podcast, but reading.
Never a podcast.
Reading a story.
Yeah, I know a lot of people do that. But I will download a nonfiction book if it's good. I listen to your books on, narrated. I really like that, especially when the writer is articulate and has a great voice. Heaps better.
Yeah.
But read in terms of holding a chopped up tree, and reading the squiggles on it to parachute into another world. There's just so much to read, and it's so wonderful to go into those. I mean, there's been this resurgence. I don't know if it's a resurgence or a surgence of Black historical fiction. Mm-hmm. James, I just finished reading.
I read James
you mentioned
a few months ago. Yeah, that's right.
What did you think?
Damn good.
It's great.
And I dreaded James, because I thought, frankly, I never enjoyed Huckleberry Finn. Like, I respected it.
You want to hear my heresy? I've never read it. I've never read it.
To be honest, my heresy is to say to you as a Black person, I wouldn't hurry. To be honest, you should read about it. It's really old. The dialect is forbiddingly thick. We've come a long way, but it's a respectable piece of work that one should read about. But I did plow my way through it so that I wouldn't get caught short in a setting like this, Huckleberry Finn. James is much better. It really is a fresh take on not only Huckleberry Finn, but on what being a slave really felt like. And we know the worst parts of it. You're working for no pay, the physical abuse, but everyday indignities that you just live under, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And then there's this wonderful conceit, which is that Jim talks like me, but then slips into the slave dialect in order to assuage the whites. But only then. They teach each other this dialect to use when whites can hear. But really, they talk like this, which means that Jim seems like a human being to us, whereas in Huckleberry Finn, well, I know what I was supposed to. And okay, that is the way Jim would have spoken, but it's hard to feel a human being in that. So yeah, James was good, but I was told basically to read it. Everybody said, oh, you should read it.
Yeah.
And I thought, do I have to return to Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and Jim. But boy, was it worth it. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I thought it was fabulous. And as you say, the idea that you can understand what it was like to be a slave, that came through more profoundly in that book than any other work of art I think that I've consumed. Like,
I would say, me
did you
too.
see 12 Years a Slave, the movie?
More heresy.
More heresy. Yeah.
No, because at the time I thought, I know this story.
Right.
It's depressing. I'm not going to learn anything new. There are a lot of movies, so I could pretend to have seen it. I could talk about it, but no, I never saw it.
Again,
was that movie like that? Did it teach you something?
No, my point of heresy is to say that it was a terrible film, and I was I was the white racist at the time, who said that 12 Years a Slave was a terrible movie.
It didn't look that
because it's been an item of faith and education since I was born that slavery, as a non-American, this is not a controversial idea that slavery was horrendously barbaric and was terrible and was there is no Confederacy in Australia. There is no, there is no pining for some lost cause. There's no it's a cut and dried thing. It's so obvious.
It was a hideous thing, right?
And to see a movie, I felt quite manipulatively sort of pick at the scab in the most grotesque and gruesome ways, where there's really no story and there's nothing apart from set piece after set piece.
That's what it looked
horror and we get it. It was a shitty regime.
As if we needed to learn this late in the game.
Yeah.
It's one thing if it's 1976, but
Oh, give me another moral insight that lynching is bad.
What it looked like. You know what was actually better, and it was around the same time. Django Unchained was an actual novel on film with a take on it that was interesting, as opposed to saying, did you know that people were beaten? Because yes, by now we do know this. Yeah. But it really did put a different spin on it, which I enjoyed.
Yes, I loved it. I mean, I love Tarantino. And what I loved about James was it's not a sequence of horrendous things happening. It's what it must feel like to be a wanted prey and to just live constantly as
in fear of the dogs.
Yeah.
And anybody who you speak to. And yeah, exactly. That you are hunted.
That's right.
You don't want to come out into the open, but you've got to eat, and you're living in swamps, and that all of that was real. And you have the people going through this who talk like us. And so it makes it seem even more searing than if they're speaking in even if you know to respect the dialect, you don't speak it, and it makes them sound far away. I really enjoy the immediacy of it.
Do you respect the dialect?
Oh, yeah. Actually, Black English is more complicated than Standard English in various fascinating ways. And if you're pawing your way through Huckleberry Finn, it's easy to think this is a minstrel distortion of the way Black people talked. But no, all language changes all the time, including Black English. And so Black English in 1875 was very different from the Black English of Chris Rock.
Yes, I'm surprised to hear you call them the same name, actually.
They're very different. Yeah. And Twain gets, almost everything right. I always think to myself, I can tell he heard real people. And so, yeah, I do respect this. It seems like this drawling dialect full of distortions, because I can see in it complexities that some of them have been lost in modern Black English, but it's hard on the eyes.
What are some of the complexities?
Oh, it's fascinating. They have, for example, I'll choose, if they say, I am doing something, sometimes they'll say, I's arter doing this. Arter, for one thing, is after. And what's interesting about arter is that you think, well, nobody ever said arter, but then you think about this. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. And you always think, well, that's a shitty rhyme. It must be that people were dumb back then. But no, it was tumbling arter. So if I'm going to do a bad accent, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling arter. So it rhymed. And so and also that you're after doing something is a way of saying that you are in the process of doing it, which actually is taken right from Irish, which is what white people spoke who learned English and came as indentured servants to the United States. So Jim, his parents probably learned that arter from these Irish English speakers. But that's a construction that we don't have and that modern Black English doesn't have.
Does it add anything, though?
This arter?
Yeah.
Let me give you something that does. In modern Black English, you say she be going. And what that means is she goes on a regular basis. We would just say she goes, and you have to guess that it means on a regular basis. You would never look at somebody and say, oh, there she be going. That would be inaccurate. In earlier Black English, that is often am. And so there was no be in that usage yet, but they use am, and it's I am, you am, he am, we am. And it sounds to us like it's just wrong, but it's not wrong. It's a different grammar where they can indicate the habitual, the everyday, in an explicit way that we leave to context. That sort of thing.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's funny when you're trying to translate between languages, and it's funny to think of a dialect as being functionally a language. The loss of what was that? Something happened to me recently. Oh, I was at a friend's place in France, and I don't drink. And I showed up at this dinner party, and I said, I don't drink. But as you know, in French, I don't drink and I'm not drinking are the same phrase.
Exactly.
So the host would later in the evening offer me.
So are you drinking now?
Yeah. Would you like a drink?
Yeah.
And I'd be like, no, I don't drink.
Je ne bois pas.
Yeah, je bois pas. And he would think that I was saying, he was like, it sounded to him, he took it as I'm not drinking tonight because I'm like, driving or I have an early morning or something.
How do you say in French, I don't drink at all?
I don't know.
Je suis something. There's going to be an adjective or something. I never thought about that. Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be just something,
Or je bois pas l'alcool or something like that to specify that that hopefully if you say I'm not drinking alcohol, they get the gist.
Je suis sec.
I'm dry.
I never thought about that.
Speaking of linguistics, I have a sense that there are terms and phrases and turns of phrase that are escaping youth culture and the culture of some sub-communities like the gay community faster or the tech community in Silicon Valley, faster into modern parlance than previously. And I can't figure out if this is because I'm getting old and so slang sounds weirder to me because I didn't grow up with it, or whether social media is allowing slang to spill out. But things like someone living rent-free in my head, or I heard someone on the radio saying putting someone on blast. Have you heard that terminology?
Or
definitely. Like someone said, don't sleep on something. Have you heard this?
Not
Sleeping on something means you don't want to not pay attention to it. You should be mindful of this thing. Like, don't sleep on this new McDonald's burger that they've got.
And
it's
now
amazing.
I'm going to hear it tomorrow. Right.
Exactly, and you'll hear it tomorrow. And then there are gay things like slay or something like that you start seeing.
A lot of gay stuff.
Yeah, in other environments.
Yeah.
Is it speeding up or am I just getting old?
I used to say nobody knows, but it's gotten to the point that I am confidently saying, it's speeding up. The churn is faster than it used to be because of social media putting so much language out there. And so an example, if you talk about gay slang jumping the rails, that's a major source, is referring to things as she that are inanimate objects. And so I heard from some of my gay students at Columbia 7 years ago that you can, 6 years ago, that you can say something like, I don't like that dress on you. She's giving old lady vibes. Or don't go up that hill. She's steep. That is now something that all hip people are using. And at the time I thought, well, that's an in-group piece of, slang, but now that's becoming real, or it's giving. And so, it's giving old lady.
Yes.
As something. Now my daughter, who's 13 and definitely not gay, and her friends are using that. And it's really become just general. That's happening faster. And it's because basically of phones. More of us can talk to one another. You see more slang. When I was that age, there were certainly things said, a lot of it no longer said, but it didn't come and go so quickly. It's fun to watch.
Yeah. Another one that, well, do they annoy you or do you find them curious? Or
I
does
love
it depend?
It's always new. It's always clever. Like, whoever thought that the verb give would be used in that way? It's giving old lady. Somebody 10 years ago hearing somebody say that now would have no blessed idea what that means.
Yeah.
It's creative, and it's not that anybody sat down and did it. Or talking about a burrito as I heard somebody say, ooh, this burrito, she's hot. what we're beginning to have meaningless gender. It's like we're becoming French. I think that's fantastic.
I wonder whether the whole gender and trans thing maybe that's a stretch, has anything to do with the playfulness around he and she. Like she's, I don't know.
I would not be surprised.
Yeah, the instinct to deformalize gender.
Yes.
To debiologify
and to make it flexible and to play with it. Maybe I would not be surprised if that were the explanation. But yeah, slang is rich today and rich partly in that it goes by so quickly. It's fantastic. Or we're allowed to curse.
Yes.
That is really what is it? Slaying cunt? Is that the expression? Has that gotten here?
It depends on the circles you swim in.
It means that something is wonderful. All the Columbia kids are saying it.
Right.
And so, boy, am I getting the expression right? I'm almost sure I am. It slays means that it's really cool. I learned that a year ago, and they're all saying it. So.
Okay. Wow. You slay cunt, John McWhorter. You definitely slay cunt. There was a turn of phrase that you're just reminding me in the terms of being or getting. I was just on holiday last week with some American friends, and I took them to this beautiful remote cliff top in South Australia, and there was a big sign that said, "Do not go past this sign," on the cliff face, and there was water. It was at the ocean. 4 people have been drowned in the past year alone.
Mm-hmm.
And my American friends looked at that and said, "They've been drowned. They've been drowned." Making fun of the construction of "they've been drowned."
Yeah.
They said, "Why isn't it just 4 people have drowned?"
Yeah.
And I couldn't quite answer that question. Here it sounds normal to me to say 4 people have been drowned. But as they said, it should just be 4 people drowned. Or 4 people have drowned. 4 people have been, and so then I tease them for the rest of the day saying, "Don't be drowning," or like, "Don't be drowned. Don't go down there. You could be drowned." Instead of "you could drown."
4 people, in American, 4 people have drowned. Here, probably in Britain, 4 people have been drowned. It's euphemistic. It implies, although technically it implies that somebody drowned them. 4 people drowned means just 4 people died. Have been drowned pulls the camera back from it somewhat rather than just naming what happened to them. Have been. And you're thinking, well, by who? God or something? And so I find it polite. I also have never thought about that. Gotten is the one that really classically defines. I have gotten. So what have you got? What have you gotten? But that's interesting. I can see why the Americans thought that was funny.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sleep on that. I think that the meaning might be the ocean is wild here and you can't tell what will happen to you, what will be done to you by the fates.
The fates.
Here.
Right.
You could get drowned.
Right.
You might not want to drown.
Yeah.
You might not drown yourself, but you could get drowned nonetheless. You know what I mean? There's something in the helplessness of it.
Yeah, get usually implies that you didn't want it to happen. You got fired or you got laid off. Although there's get laid, which is different, and so it implies that maybe it was unexpected.
It's a peculiar scenario in which you don't want to get laid, and you get laid nonetheless against your will.
Yeah, it's called the got passive, and it's basically unexpected. So if you get laid, presumably there was a chance that you weren't going to, and you got lucky. But yeah, I've gotten laid, I've got laid. And so I've got laid, I've gotten laid. Gotten is American. That's from the 1800s. That's the difference. But I never thought about that then.
Yeah.
To be honest, I must admit that I was thinking, you've got this sign, don't walk past this sign. And my first thought was Benny Hill. So, of course, who's going to walk past it and what's going to happen? And there's that music in the background. But I wasn't thinking about the drowning.
Yeah, do not throw rocks at this sign, as the apocryphal sign says.
Right.
Exactly. Are there any particular grammar rules that you would abolish if you could snap your fingers?
Oh, hell yeah. In my next book, Pronoun Trouble, I have a whole chapter about this because I wanted to get through it. The idea that you can't say Billy and me went to the store because you would never say me went to the store
Yeah.
is a lie. That is a complete hoax.
Don't
Nobody
tell me
talked
this,
about
John.
that.
I correct my daughter. I correct my 7-year-old daughter.
You have to, because formally we have to obey this silly rule. But then, until very recently, you had to wear ankle socks instead of having socks that covered up your leg a little bit. Even though they're mosquitoes and moles and mice and dirt, it's better to have the tube socks. But no, starting in, I guess, about 1995, you have to have the little socks. You have to observe it. You can't walk around in tube socks. Well, with Billy and me went to the store, we've been told that that's wrong because you don't say me went to the store. But nobody talks about how in French, Guillaume et moi sommes allés au magasin. Billy and I went to the store. Guillaume et je sommes allés. No, you would be smacked on the head. But for some reason in English, we have to observe this Latin rule. That's just something some people made up starting in the early 1700s. And now we're stuck with it. But I really wish you could roll the camera back and get rid of one, slavery, and two, the idea that you're supposed to say Billy and I went to the store. The rule makes no sense on so many levels.
I do like that slavery made it to the top of the list. You don't need to see 12 Years a Slave now. I think you've got the memo.
Now
you're clearly on board.
My bona fides? That's
yeah,
right.
exactly.
But
You've proven yourself that you've got the memo.
Billy and me sucks.
Okay.
In my real life, I say him and me went to the store. Not he and I went to the store. And for example, why can't you say I and Billy went to the store? If it's all about subject object, why is it that when you say I and Billy went to the store, you feel like a Martian? It's not a real rule at all.
I mean, there's an interesting thing that Americans do here, which sounds overly formal to a non-American ear, which is to pick up the phone and say, this is he. Or this is she.
Have you ever heard anybody say that?
Yeah, my roommate in New York used to. She would say hello, and then they'd say, "Is this so and so? Can I speak to so and so?" And she'd say, "This is she."
Was she Patricia Routledge playing Hyacinth Bouquet? Was she 80?
No, but she was a well-spoken Southern.
Was she doing it
girl.
in a certain frisky irony, or did she really mean?
No, she had been told by pedantic parents that the correct way to say it is this is she.
And what's interesting is that we all know how awkward that sounds.
It's so weird.
And
I had to look up whether it was correct or not.
The ancient grammarians always make an exception for it. Even, the funny thing is, back in Old English and Middle English, nobody ever made this quote unquote mistake. Nobody ever said Billy and me went to the store. Everybody said Billy and I. People started saying Billy and me because the grammar started changing. But even in Old English, where everything is Hrothgar and I engaged in battle. When somebody knocks on the door in Old English or Middle English, it's me, because of the way English really works. And then, nevertheless, you have some people who say it is I, out of a sense that that's how the rule is supposed to work.
Yeah.
Weird.
I mean, I think one reason why people instinctively say me instead of I when they're talking about multiple people is because sometimes you start the sentence with me and then you want to add on the other person and you don't want to go back and change it to I, right? Like you might start the sentence thinking I'm going to say, oh, well, hang on. No, that would work the other way, right? That would say I, if you wanted to say I was going to the park, then you would say, yeah. Cancel that. That's not correct. But I think something else is happening with my daughter when she says me and Piper went to the park.
To tell you the truth, there's no such thing as an Anglophone child who spontaneously says, well, Hannah and I are going to play with marbles now. All children say Hannah and me because as you learn the rules of the language, this idea that I is always the subject is not something you follow. So, for example, let's say that your daughter is named Hannah and she broke a lamp. So, Hannah, who broke the lamp? Come on, tell the truth. What she's going to say is me. Now, she would never say me broke the lamp, but she would never say I. No kid would do that. But I is the
Unless
subject.
She was saying I did.
If she said I did.
Yes.
But what she's really going to say is, who did it? Me. Or who did it? Them. You would never say who did it? They? No. Right. And that means that right there, you're breaking the rule.
Yes.
English's rule is that there is one first person singular pronoun that's default, subject or object, me. You use I, I'm oversimplifying, but when it's right up next to the verb and by itself. So I changed a tire. The minute that you've got an and involved, though, it becomes a me. And so Billy and me changed the tire. Who did it? Me. Who's at the door? It's me. Me is the first person singular pronoun. I is this quirk that happens when it's next to the verb. Or I actually did it, something that comes in between.
Yeah.
That's the rule, like in French. Like, what is the real pronoun? It's either moi or moi. Je is something that happens right next to the verb.
Yes.
But we're not allowed to admit it.
Okay, let's do it. Let's change it. I'm done.
It happened right here.
Do we need apostrophes?
No, we do not.
Good.
That's another thing. And frankly, I couldn't imagine writing without it, but that's an accident. We could use it in order to disambiguate here and there, but German has the same s as we do, and they don't use an apostrophe. And look at how persnickety and precise they are. The apostrophe is an accident. And I believe you'd be surprised how quickly you forget what you write or say. I think I did a New York Times piece about the apostrophe not making any sense. And I didn't get that much pushback either. I think people get it. But because of path dependence, I would have a hard time letting the apostrophe go. It would look wrong on the page.
Yeah.
But if you could roll the camera back, it would be good to 1, get rid of slavery, 2, get rid of Billy and me, 3, the apostrophe.
I mean, I think we should just get rid of it because the people who don't really know how to use it are being forced to use something that they don't need to use. And the people who do know how to use it get constantly irritated by how many people don't know how to use it.
Especially when there's a plural.
Right. The greengrocer's apostrophe of, oranges, $5 a bag, with an apostrophe on the oranges.
We're laughing at that poor man.
It's like, yeah, but sometimes it looks wrong not to have it. Like, I understand if, orange is not a good example, but there would be something which ends in, a vowel that doesn't look quite right if you put actually, potato. There was a famous case in the UK where there was a senior politician who went to a school and was spelling in front of the class, and there were cameras there, and he wrote potatoes incorrectly. I don't think it was an apostrophe problem, but he got absolutely annihilated for not knowing how to spell the word potatoes.
Josh, that story is better if it's in Britain. I wish it had been in Britain, but that was in the States.
Was it?
That was Vice President Dan Quayle.
Get out.
Who was known for being kind of an idiot. And he was in a school and misspelled potato, and he never got it. Actually,
was it that he put an E on the end of the word potato?
End of it in the singular. Because it has it in plural. The poor man, he never got past it. He's still alive and he's still dumb.
I love it.
No, that would be better in Britain, but it
was he sitting in a tank wearing a helmet at the time? He was misspelling the word potato.
That's even better. If it were Dukakis.
That's the only thing I know about. Oh, that wasn't even the same guy.
That was Michael Dukakis.
This is the file. This is the very thin file folder in Josh's brain, which contains hapless American vice presidents
in the
and
movie.
presidential.
It's the same man who was in the helmet and then goes into potatoes.
That's right. I would get rid of the apostrophe. Also, it makes no sense that we don't have a possessive apostrophe on the word it's.
That's
you teach your children all this stuff about how the apostrophes work, and then there's this one exception where the dog and its bone. The dog's bone has an apostrophe. The dog and its bone should have an apostrophe.
People fuck that up all the time because of it is versus its and yours versus yours. Yeah, it's a complete. No, there's no your. Sorry, folks, that's my jet lag. But yeah, it's. And people tend not to get it right, even rather literate people.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to just kind of get rid of it and just say ITS in both cases and get rid of this thing that seems almost designed to allow people like you and me to laugh at people who didn't get it right.
Yeah. Exactly. But I don't, and I won't, and I will just let's just get rid of it. Let's vote to get rid of it.
Let's kill it.
The sort of fame and renown that you've acquired over the past decade, I guess, as a result of the social justice revolution and your courage and I suppose contrarianism on several of those.
Obsessive and compulsive. Yeah, which is really what it is.
If you could turn back time, would you have that? I mean, is this a welcome attribute in your life, that aspect of your reputation, or not welcome?
I hate to say this because I've seen people in my position write and say this sort of thing, and they look ungrateful. I don't mean to strike that note, but when it comes to the social justice anti-woke part, that did, after 2020, put me in a new place. And no, it's not what I chose. And the truth is, being known mainly for that and elevated as one of the brown faces who can be depended upon to tell the truth about these social justice issues, I didn't choose it. And although it's nice to be made a big deal of sometimes. Deep down, I'm somebody who is at home reading my books and, raising my 2 daughters. I'm a very musical person. I like to make food. I've got a lot of hobbies. That's me. Whereas there are other me's where I think that really their essence, not that they don't like to cook and read too, but they want to be out and about pressing the flesh and, being famous.
You mean literally other human beings or parts of you?
What do you mean?
When you said there are other me's, do you mean that there are other people?
No,
or do you mean that there are other parts of John McWhorter?
Other men and women.
Right.
Yeah, who are, in a similar position to me where I think they really enjoy the flesh pressing. Whereas for me, deep down, I'm this guy who's at home and all of this happened and it's a duty. I think it's really important to be a black person of a certain age, but not old yet, who upholds those views. What I really get off on is that all of that meant that the New York Times tapped me, and they are frankly wonderful to work for. And it's a magnificent pulpit because everything you write, all reading people read. That is a high. And with the column, I write about language, race, and music, not only race. And I would say race isn't even half. So if you know me from the Times, and if you think of me as somebody you want to shake hands with or invite me to something because of the Times, that's great. But when it's come and let's talk about wokeness, let's talk about free speech, that's a duty. And there are times when I think, am I being pulled away from, for example, my academic linguistics for that? And so, yeah, it's a bit of a burden. I've been weary over the past few years because, and this sounds like I'm trying to make myself sound like I'm in some play, but am I losing myself because of being called upon to be a spokesman for all of these things? And the truth is a little, but then on the other hand, if none of this had happened, my life wouldn't be nearly as interesting. And I think I would be bored with my life as it was, say, just 10 years ago, because I needed a third act. So that's the gloomy answer to that question.
Well, I mean, in addition to the liability of becoming weary and not having as much time to sit there with your pipe and your slippers and
dinosaurs
your books and your brandy,
right.
There's also the liability, I presume, and tell me if I'm wrong, of finding yourself unwittingly associated with bedfellows who you wouldn't choose and maybe being called upon by people who have a less nuanced understanding of the issue than you might.
Sure.
And not knowing whether or not at some point you're contributing positively or negatively to the overall net conversation.
I'm very careful about that, which requires effort that I then am not putting into, the pipe and the brandy. But I really don't want today's right wing to think that I'm one of them. And so, for example, in advertising my books, I always make it clear in the contract, no MAGA people, no Fox News, except the occasional exception, no Hannity. I want nothing to do with any of those people. And so there's that. I don't take speaking invitations from people like that. I do not speak before Federalist societies. I don't speak before the conservative think tanks, except for the Manhattan Institute, who I used to work for and who always harbor a lot of Democrats. And so we have an old relationship. But the other think tanks, I make the very occasional exception if it's for a friend and it's not going to be me promulgating some right-wing agenda. And I think that that's actually worked. Like, for example, my loathing for Donald Trump is endless to the point that there are times when I think I need to really take it easy and take a long hot shower. I think he's one of the most disgusting human beings I have ever been aware of in my entire life. And I make that clear. So right there, that means that none of those people would want to come anywhere near me. But yeah, there's going to be some bleed. There are going to be some right-wing people who think, well, look at what John McWhorter said. But I can't stanch that bleeding because I don't want to be the kind of figure who is so worried about them that I hedge what I say so much that I'm not saying anything. And there are black writers like that who are very worried that Newt Gingrich or, Christopher Rufo is going to listen to what they're saying. And frankly, I turned down a podcast with Newt Gingrich the other day. But if I'm going to worry too much about that sort of thing, then between all of the well maybes and to be sures, etc., I'll write pieces that are very intelligent, but don't make a point that sticks in your head. and then nobody pays attention to me, and then all I get to do is drink brandy and read about dinosaurs, and that's not what I want. So there's going to be some bleed.
Mm. What do you make of the willingness of many people in the anti-woke center-left and center-right to tolerate Donald Trump and the current cultural right?
I have had to wrestle with trying to get myself into the head of intelligent people who can break bread with that person because they would prefer him to what they think of as the hideousness of wokeness. I have to work to understand, and I think I'm beginning to in most cases, how you could listen to him and think this is a person who should be a steward of a mature society. I choose him based on the things that he's saying. I would rather risk this than, for example, Kamala Harris, because she's too woke and she has a silly laugh. And she wasn't a great candidate. But wow, it really does. It's funny. You learn about the diversity of humanity. I had a relationship 35 years ago where I learned from her how different two people could be who had the same middle class upbringing, same opportunities, just our tastes, our attitudes. I thought, wow, people can be really different. I'm learning that lesson again now in realizing that a me can pull the lever for that man. It's hard, though. And to look at what's happened over the past 2 months, wasn't it clear this is the way it was going to be? But for many people, this is better than things would have been under a President Kamala Harris. I have to work really hard. And I'm trying because I don't believe in calling people crazy. I don't get off on despising people. I don't want to think that I'm living in a broken country. But wow, it's been really tough. And I'm despised by many people on the right and even in the center for saying things like this because I'm insulting the person they voted for and therefore, by extension, them. I'm sorry, but I can't help it. It's the only way I can see it.
How do you get on with Glenn Lowry about this, a colleague and friend, with you whom you do a podcast?
Glenn and I have had some real set-tos about Trump, especially because a lot of the listenership are disgusted with me because I'm so implacably opposed to and scornful of Trump. We even had an off-the-record exchange about it the other day because it's hard. It's getting really tough. He and I will be okay because we both respect different points of view, but it's gotten hard. I would say our hardest conversations have been about that and then about Ta-Nehisi Coates' book about his trip to Israel. That was that one because there's a certain amount of histrionic, that's the wrong word. There's a certain amount of theater involved in doing a podcast when you know that there are people who are watching. Glenn and I know what we're doing. I know when to cue him to one of the Glenn rants or something like that. We're doing jazz. The one time when I actually was upset, when I was thinking I'm angry now and this is not just play acting, was during the Ta-Nehisi Coates Israel Gaza conversation. And Glenn felt the same way when we stopped that one.
Just tell people the contours of that disagreement.
Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a book where he went to Israel and
he's a prominent intellectual black left-wing writer.
Yes, very prominent. He's a superstar. And his latest book is, among other things, but the main part of his latest book, which is called The Message, is that he spent a short period of time being taken around Israel and being shown the situation in Gaza. And he came away feeling that there is a genocide happening and that what's going on with Gaza in Israel is what he would call an apartheid. That is a view that he is allowed to have. But I felt that he hadn't really studied the prelude to the current situation very much, and that I found his analysis superficial.
And this was pre-October 7th that he went. And I think he went to the West Bank, right? Not Gaza, but he was looking at...
He did not go to... No, I think he did see Gaza, I'm pretty sure, but it was before October 7th. But as far as he was concerned, Coates, in the interviews that he did, everything that he said in the book pre-October 7th applied. He was one of the people who tacitly feels that what Hamas did while unfortunate or troubling, as people like him would say, was an inevitable and, in a certain abstract sense, defensible response to what Israel has done. All of this is very Frantz Fanon. I find that an overly simplified view of what has happened in that area over the past roughly 125 years. I just think that it doesn't take account of the complexity. And Coates' view is that there's nothing complex about it, that there are times when you have to stop thinking of things as complex. There's just a simple moral calculus. Glenn thought that Coates wrote a good book. He didn't agree with everything, but he respected what Coates had done, which is interesting because Glenn and I in the past on the show have criticized Coates in general, and Glenn has always lit into him more strongly than me. But for reasons I don't completely understand, and I genuinely don't, Glenn was more patient with this book than I expected. And so we just got into an Israel argument. Neither of us are Jewish, but it got not nasty, but we were both frustrated. And when that show was over, we said, "Are we okay?" Which had never happened before. And we are okay. But that was a tough show. That was a really hard show.
It was because of that conversation that I read the book,
Really?
which I hadn't been planning to. Yes.
Huh. Do you like it?
No.
Okay.
But I'm glad I read it. I really think he's a really interesting writer, and I think he has an incredible turn of phrase.
He's great with a pen.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that.
But it is...
Is it fresher in your mind? He didn't go to Gaza. You would remember because
well,
I read it like 6 months ago.
You had that conversation
Like
at
6
least
months ago?
6 months ago, I would have thought. Yeah, I think I
Yes.
read it about 4 months ago. My recollection is that it was mostly the West Bank because I think he was mostly talking about the indignities of Palestinians having to go through checkpoints and stuff, which is
right.
really a West Bank phenomenon where you've got the settlements and
Exactly.
and you like because Israel isn't in Gaza,
Right.
it wasn't in Gaza prior to
Right.
October 7th.
At that time, right.
My assumption was that he was witnessing all of these indignities in the daily lives of Palestinians who are constantly bumping up against Israeli checkpoints in Israel, and that would be the West Bank, yeah, because in Gaza there was no bumping up against Israelis. It was just a Hamas stronghold.
Yeah.
But I do think it's in the single point that I thought that Glenn honed in on in an interesting way, and you had great responses to it, was this point that you just alluded to about like maybe we can sometimes overthink things, and maybe treating an Arab in the West Bank differently than you treat a Jew in the West Bank is prima facie wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go through as many millions of words and column inches as you want to try to justify it. But to take the analogy to, for example, the death penalty, I oppose the death penalty. Ta-Nehisi Coates would say it doesn't matter whether or not it's for a terrorist or for someone who stole a loaf of bread. It's a principle that the death penalty is wrong. I oppose it regardless of the circumstances. Similarly, I oppose treating people differently on the basis of their ethnicity or religion, regardless of what the excuse is.
Yeah,
you're not pulled by the moral tug of that sensibility?
No, because the question is, and this is relitigating what Glenn and I talked about, yes, the Arabs are being treated differently at the checkpoints, but the question is why? And if the reason why...
But the question isn't why if you just stop the conversation before you get to the why.
Right. But
the question is whether that's a legitimate intellectual move to do.
Frankly,
right?
No.
You could say terrorism is wrong, the death penalty is wrong, and we are carving off, and then we're just putting a full stop, a period.
Right.
And then you don't get to the why.
Right. Of course, the issue is, what do you do about what happened in the past? The Israelis have a reason to believe that if they treated the Palestinians the way the Jews are treated, they would be in danger of being bombed to death. And that's a fact, which I think many Palestinians would say was justified. And I'm even open to the argument that it is. I understand why they might say that this is the only way that we can reverse what happened in the past. And I would say maybe you can't reverse it. But there's a real argument to be had. But I get impatient with the idea that we look at it just the way it is right now at this minute and say this isn't right, as if it's obvious what would be. You know what I mean? Okay, if this isn't the way it should be, how should it be? Should it be that all those barriers are just taken away? Because obviously you can see why Israel wouldn't want that. And that's why this is probably the knottiest geopolitical situation on Earth.
I like that your accent makes naughty sound like naughty to me, because it is a naughty geopolitical situation as well. It's naughty.
Nutty.
It's naughty. Yeah, no, look, I just think Ta-Nehisi Coates is I am exactly his target market, right? You know, a sort of center, left, vaguely guilty for my colonial past, white guy. Even though I'm of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and
so there's a complication.
So it's complicated,
right?
But nonetheless, he has a way of articulating what it feels like to be a young, shat upon black man in fear of his life from a white supremacist superstructure.
Yeah,
that is compelling and is catnip to me.
I get that. I think there's an aspect of him that sticks in my craw, and it's not his fault. I would not do differently if I were him. But Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't like white people. I've heard him almost say it on a podcast, and frankly, I'm black too, and I know from his facial demeanor, I've seen him around white people, his history, he's a type. He doesn't like white people. When white people aren't around, he's the type of person with a beer who'll say, I don't like them, with a laugh. I get it. He doesn't like white people in terms of the way they've treated us and the way maybe they treat us now. He would think about the cops. But what it means is that he's writing to that audience that you talk about. And I don't think he thinks of himself as writing only for black people. I think he knows that mainly it's these white people who think of him as catnip. And it bothers me a little bit that he hates them, that he writes all of this. He gets, paid by these people. He gets lauded by these people. I think a lot of his readers think that if they read him and they internalize the gospel, then somebody like him or he won't hate them anymore. I always think to myself, you realize he still hates you, and he will go to his grave thinking of white people as aliens. That's a weird career to me, and he couldn't do it any other way. I'm not saying that he shouldn't take the money because he doesn't like white people, but I figure you're supposed to respect your audience. I don't think he does, and I don't think that it's a grift. He's not thinking, I'm going to get money from all these white motherfuckers. It's not that. If they're going to pay him, why should he not take the money? But I find it unsavory. He doesn't like the people who are praising him. That's weird to me.
I'm trying to analyze my emotion, my reaction to that claim. One part of me thinks, well, you don't know that he doesn't like white people.
I can't know absolutely.
Yeah. Another part of me thinks maybe I've earned his dislike somewhat by being part of a cohort that has done such things.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of me thinks maybe it's better to read the person who doesn't like me and earn some brownie points in trying to understand my opponent. I don't want to call it that, maybe opponent is too harsh, but the person who believes they have reason to condemn me rather than not reading it.
Yeah. And I get it.
And another part of me thinks it's shortchanging him because he's not writing a screed. He's not writing a screed. He's not yelling at me.
No,
he's trying to articulate what it feels like to be in his skin. I think in an honest way.
Yes, definitely in an honest way. He's not grifting at all. Here's the next level of it. I think his sense of white people as evil is exaggerated. And I think that there's a kind of person like him that nurtures a sense of white people as that kind of enemy, as a sense, giving you a sense of security and purpose. I think that within his lifespan, white people have not been what he writes about. Many people I know of him who, are kind of on the fence about him say, reading him about race, you would think that he grew up in the 1950s and 60s, and not 1910, but, you would think that he was his dad. And I think he gets a lot of this from his father. But I've watched him in rooms full of educated white people, and he's guarded. You can tell he kind of wants to go home. And I'm thinking, Ta-Nehisi, what did they do to you? All of these people adore you. You're thinking that really at the base of it all is this quiet but implacable racism, and you're thinking about the police. But then there are a lot of holes in his story about his supposed friend, Prince, etc. And a whole other rant of mine is that I think that in our time now, there is a vast exaggeration of the extent to which racism determines cops' actions. And it comes from basically the sheer statistics. And so I don't think that Ta-Nehisi Coates and I could ever agree on that if we would ever have a debate about it, which we won't. But his sense that the cops are quiet racists where their racism comes out when they're in a tight situation and they pull the trigger. I get what he means in 1970. I don't think that's true now. And I don't think that it's so hard to see that that's not true now. But he maintains that narrative. So that's another part of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, part of the challenge for the majority audience of cultural theories like his and yours and Coleman's and Glenn's and whoever else, Thomas Chatterton Williams, or Robin DiAngelo, or, whatever.
What an interesting group.
I want to see that dinner party.
That would be fun.
Part of it is that as a white person, we don't really have the ability, unless you're Robin DiAngelo, who can apparently feel like a black person.
Knows everything and she's in our head. Yeah.
Yeah. Part of the challenge is that we don't know what it's like to be a person of color in the United States. So I don't know what level of credence to give to claims that walking into a subway station or walking into an H&M store or walking into Tiffany's or walking through Central Park after dark is different if my skin were your color. Right? I can't tell. I don't get to have that second experience. I don't get to see whether or not people look at me differently, whether they shuffle away from me differently. And so I have to take it on faith.
You do.
To some extent, that the claims that people who say it's a problem are that they're not making it up, but they might be making it up, and I don't know how to tell.
Josh, that's the hardest part. They are. And I don't say that as an opinion. I say that as fact. I've been walking around unmistakably black in the United States and mostly in cities for what's going on 60 years, very aware of all these claims. The idea that when you walk into a store, you're trailed, that you're walking down the street and you can hear people locking their car doors, that white women hold their purses closer, that you walk into Central Park and people are giving you funny looks and they think that you might be homeless no matter how you're dressed, that in general, you walk around being slandered and that's the fabric of your life. Coleman, Thomas, Glenn, and I all would tell you that story that's been being told since about 1970, the people who say that are vastly exaggerating. Now, do things happen? Black kids kicked out of a swimming pool by whites who think that there's something wrong with them being there. A couple of black men being chased out of a Starbucks because they're sitting there and they're not ordering any coffee. But what does that hurt? They get chased out, but white equivalents are not. All of those things do happen. They're very occasional. They make big news, but they are not the fabric of black existence today. Now, in 1960, yes. Even in 1980, and I'm old enough to remember things like sitting on a commuter train car, 1980, 1979, and it fills up, and I'm this nerdy black kid. I'm wearing glasses, I'm reading a book, and I'm sitting in a seat. The seat next to me is the very last one to fill up. It's not that nobody's going to sit there. I'm not Rosa Parks, but finally a white guy will sit there, but you can tell there's a reason why mine was the last one. That was now 45 years ago. It hasn't been like that for a long time. And Coleman Hughes, who is like 7, has never experienced any of it. And so there is a commitment that a lot of black guys in particular have. Frankly, I'm going to say, given the sorts of things that they'd say very tart things about me and my supposed intentions, they're exaggerating. And you're thinking, well, why should I listen to him? But then again, it's not just me. It's all of us heterodox people. So Mark Lamont Hill, who I respect very much, he and I don't agree on anything, but we don't hate each other. Mark would say, yes, when I walk around, I feel black. I'm treated a certain way. If Mark and I could have a real heavy hour-long conversation, maybe with a glass of wine, where I could politely drill him and he could drill me, Mark is exaggerating. And I'm not saying Mark has ever said it, but I'm guessing that that's what he would say.
Right.
No, Mark and I have the same experience. And no, it's not the way it was. If it were that way, I would write very differently. But the civil rights movement happened for a reason.
You said a couple of interesting things in that. answer. One was that you were a nerdy kid,
Mm-hmm.
and the other was that if you were walking through Central Park after dark, dressed the same way as everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that part of what's going on is that there are socioeconomic biases which are being superimposed on race or vice versa, in the sense that
Sure.
there are certain ways of dressing and walking and strutting and behaving
Sure.
that code as
Thug,
right? Yeah, but and
when
in
really a
America
person
that's
might not be a thug.
racialized. Yeah, but in a country with a less,
Sure.
if there was more egalitarianism, if you had, I don't know, if it was more like Sweden or Denmark or something, then maybe these would all be white, blonde, blue-eyed, swaggering, thugs who need to be trailed in supermarkets.
Yeah, and my point is that the claim is that it happens no matter what kind of black person you are. So let's say that you've got somebody with what used to be called the short drop walk and the certain, the big shirts and a certain way of presenting themselves. Yes, white people's response to that kind of person might be somewhat different. However, is it based on nothing, or is it based on the fact that there are people who conduct themselves in that way and have those demeanors who are somewhat dangerous? For example, on the New York subway, let's try this. If you are a dangerous person, chances are that is your accoutrement, that is the way you walk, etc. Then you could be somebody who fronts that way but is not a criminal. Thomas Chatterton Williams writes about having been that kind of a kid. I think we're expecting white people to be pretty good junior sociologists to always be able to tell the difference. And this does not justify shooting anybody or anything like that. But yeah, bias that somebody like that might feel. But it's not true that any black person labors under this constant, quiet, but ongoing abuse, as in Ellis Coase, a black writer who wrote The Rage of a Privileged Class back in the early 90s, where he wrote, why are middle-class black people so upset? And he wrote about the sorts of experiences that middle-class black people had been having in his time, which is now the 70s and 80s. It's completely different.
I mean, I believe that they believe it. I believe that they think that they feel. I believe that they feel it, right?
They
in the
are
sense that
not
you notice
pretending.
what you notice. Yeah.
Yeah.
My grandmother, who's the Holocaust survivor, saw anti-Semitism everywhere, even in suburban Sydney, where I could tell that it was not anti-Semitism. It was people being biased against a crazy old lady. You know what I mean?
That's actually a perfect, almost perfect analogy.
If you rerun the history of the world a 1,000 times, in how many of those universes are you a linguist?
All of them. That's deep. I would have been a linguist of some sort. I was 5, and there was this book that we had. I've gone on eBay and found that book. I almost want to buy it. It was a not very good dictionary, but for some reason in the back of it, they had this word list, and it's ingrained in my mind, a word list of English, French, Spanish, Italian, German, French, Spanish, Italian, German, Swedish, and Yiddish. I remember. And that's a weird set of languages.
Yeah,
like why
I was just gonna
Yiddish?
Say,
it's like, and it wasn't a Jewish book, but they had those 6. And I just thought,
you've already got German in there as well, which they're close.
And that's right.
And Yiddish.
And it's the mid-20th century. I never thought about that till right now. But that weird choice. And I thought, these languages. And my mother had told me about what this thing called French was. There were no Latinos in my life when I was a little kid. In Mount Airy in Philadelphia, there were probably 2 Latino families. So I didn't know from Spanish. But these languages, and there are these 6 ways that you can say a word. And I now know that most kids would have looked at that and thought, well, yeah, and that they have other interests. But to me, that was just mesmerizing. And at 11, I got a record set. My mother gave me a record set of Spanish, 4 LPs, and you're supposed to teach yourself Spanish. And the weird thing about it is that I actually did get through the set. I didn't just do one side of one record. I went through the whole thing. And of course, you don't come out of it speaking Spanish. But the fact that I wanted to do that, I am fascinated by other languages. Just this morning at the hotel, there was a guy talking and on the phone, and instantly, because I couldn't get it, I was thinking, what is that language? What is it? And so I'm listening closely, and I'm listening, and I thought, it's Baltic. Okay, because it sounds kind of like Russian, but it isn't. And so it's going to be either Latvian or Lithuanian. I couldn't get it any further than that. Then I heard him talking to somebody and saying that he was Latvian, and I kind of patted myself.
Wow.
And why do I care about that? And so it's just, it's a gene. So you could roll it again and again and again. If you rolled it even one time again, the reason that I became a race commentator is such serendipity. That wouldn't have happened at all. But I would definitely be doing something linguistical. Yeah.
What was the nature of the serendipity on the race commentating? It was just the fact that the particular cultural moment happened?
Oh yeah. I happened, it's kind of like there would be no life if like the ions weren't like this, like the cosmos has to be a certain
It's
way.
like a teleological argument for existence,
Right,
is
that.
why you,
So some God must have set it up. I was in the late 90s. I happened to be in the Bay Area when the Oakland school system happened to propose using Black English as a teaching tool. I happened to be the Black linguist in the area, so the media called me. And I said, the reason Black kids are having trouble learning to read is because the schools are bad, which I thought was a pretty liberal point. But I said, you do not need to use dialect readers to help them learn to read. It's been shown that that doesn't work. It was just a perfectly logical argument. Well, I didn't know about wokeness then. I was not saying the right thing because I wasn't battling white supremacy. So I got in trouble, which meant I was notorious, which meant, and for me, if you step to me, what I do is I write a book. And so I wrote a book about that. And that kind of put me somewhere. And I thought that was my 15 minutes. I hadn't sought it and I thought that was it. But
And
then,
let me just pause on that. Why is it that you go off and you write a book to prove your case instead of sucking it up?
Because no matter how many times you rolled the tape, I would be a compulsive writer. That's another neuron of mine. You don't want to say it because you sound like you're bragging. I'm just describing. Somehow I write fast. And that was true when I was like 3. When I was 5, I told my mother, I want to be a book writer. And what I meant was not telling stories. I meant I want to write nonfiction books, like the kind of baby nonfiction books you could get from the library. So when I get mad, I want to make my case. And especially back then, there's no such thing as a podcast yet. So it wasn't, I'm going to go on the radio because you can only go on the radio once. And so my thought was, I need to have my say. Since I write so fast, I'm going to write a book about this. And then I felt it was therapy. But then hot on the heels of that was the debate over racial preferences. And people were speaking it was like Thomas Aquinas, the code that people talked about racial preference issues in. So much euphemism, so much, frankly, lying, so much distortion. I understood why people were upset, but I was frustrated at how coded the debate was and how the people who didn't like the demise of racial preferences wouldn't engage in a real discussion. And I got frustrated and I was a fly on the wall at some meetings and I thought, this doesn't work. If these people want what they want, which is to reverse the demise of racial preferences, and the question is, do you want that? But if you want it, you have to make a good faith argument. It frustrated me that people wouldn't listen to the other side. So I wrote, because I was teaching a lot of Black and white students at the same time, I wrote about my experiences in a book called Losing the Race. And I think many people would think I spent 2.5 years toiling, but no, I wrote it in literally in 6 months because I can do that.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, okay, people will know what I think because I thought a lot of people, including Black people, think what I think. And I thought this will get around in the Bay Area. It'll make some more people hate me, but I feel cleansed and I feel like this needs to be part of the discussion. If I hadn't been at Berkeley to experience all of that, if I had happened to get a job at UT Austin, University of Texas at Austin, then I wouldn't have written any of that. And I would still just be some unknown linguistics professor. So it was just chance.
I suspect that the events of 2017 to 2022 would have dragged you into the culture wars in some way, because it sounds like what you're talking about is a sort of intellectual catharsis where something aggrieves your sense of common sense that you feel, and the need to release your intellect into that sphere.
And if I was at UT Austin as a linguistics professor, that's an interesting hypothetical, in 2017, and I started getting angry at all of this hyper wokeness, then I would have written something that maybe would have run in the New York Times one time, but they wouldn't have then asked me to write more things. I think it would have just been, somebody would have had me on 2 podcasts, but that's it. Because by the time 2017 happened, I had a kind of a footprint. But it really all started with the Ebonics controversy, as it was called, the Black English controversy, and then the demise of racial preferences in the University of California schools, and the fact that I happened to be a Black linguistics professor at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley at the time. If I hadn't been, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'm pretty
It's
sure.
amazing, isn't it? Like just the randomness. The chance.
Yeah.
I want to get you out of here in 7 or 8 minutes so that you can make your next event at the University of Sydney. So I'm going to do some rapid fire questions. You can answer it with one word. We can do it's like a sort of a Rorschach, or you can elaborate if you want to. Okay. And you can just tell me what you think of these things. I'll fire a word at you. TikTok.
Never watched it. My daughters were all about it. They were very upset at the idea that it was going to be withdrawn from them. That is not my format.
Capitalism.
Capitalism is the best of many evils. I'm not sure how we would work things out, and I don't believe that Marxism would be better if we quote unquote really tried it, or if it's true, that's not going to happen in the real world.
Populism.
Populism is becoming a very vague word, and so I'm not sure what I think about it. Populism from the left, populism from the right, people power. I mean, William Jennings Bryan, know nothings, pitchforks. I think it's really more of a cudgel than an actual term.
Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis is somebody, I always think of him as someone who made perfect sense to himself, as most people do. You think of there being evil. Jefferson Davis thought of slavery as a natural state of things. I hate to say, as a Black person, I can put myself into the head of a white person a long time ago and imagine how that felt right. And he felt that what he was doing was constitutional. I can imagine how that felt right. He thought that he was founding another nation. I also would not have him over for dinner for the obvious reason, but he made sense to himself.
He may not have been so generous towards you.
No, I don't think he was.
Candace Owens.
I don't follow her. I think that her ravings reveal a rather charismatic idiocy. And I often say that I'm not aware of any Black conservative figures who are saying the things that they're saying just to get out there and to make money. All of the Black conservative figures that I've been aware of, even if you don't agree with them, really, they feel themselves as sincere pro-Black actors. I can only think of one person in the whole set of Black conservatives where I would say that wasn't true. And I'm not going to out him by saying it, because what would be the point? But Candace Owens, from what I've seen, is a huckster, and she's a little bit embarrassing. But then again, I think anybody who matters has her number at this point.
Elon Musk.
There's something wrong with him. I really do think that he's a little bit off. The fact that he has become the Prime Minister of the United States is a travesty of anything one might consider justice.
That's such a good way of putting it. I hadn't thought about that. Yes.
We have a Prime Minister.
You do have a Prime Minister now.
And so that.
Yeah, that's interesting. China.
One, I've never been. Two, I think that it's awkward to see how the authoritarianism of that nation means that in many ways, for at least elite and middle class people, it's a country that can actually get things done. However, their Machiavellian way of looking at things and their lack of interest in human rights, their sense that human rights is not the moral absolute that we're taught they are, which I definitely think they are, it's chilling to see. And I worry about the possibility of a World War III where one of our adversaries was a country that does not subscribe to our sense of what human values, what humanity means, and the sense that there are certain universal laws. China.
Well, have we ever fought an adversary who shared those values?
No.
Whether it's the Soviet Union or
Nazi
Germany
at certain times.
Or
and now we're going back to
Japan.
To that. Yeah. And of course, Japan has grown, but China doesn't have to have grown. And so, yeah, I worry sometimes.
Who misunderstands you the most, the left or the right?
I'm supposed to say the left, because not nearly as much as back in the day, because I've been in the biz for 25 years now. There will always be a hardcore of people on the left who think of me as a right-wing conservative who's out to make money and get attention and doesn't like black people. There will always be that group. Most of them, though, formed their view of me in about 2003 and naturally haven't bothered to engage me since because we're all busy. And why would you bother with me if that's the feeling? That's now a small, hard kernel, and it's overrepresented in academia. There are some humanities and social science academics who think I'm just the worst person. And I sometimes think, do you read me? What did I do?
No, is the answer.
Now, but the truth is at this point, I'm getting the most violent verbally feedback from the right since I've shown that I really think that Donald Trump is a gorilla in a suit and really just will not compromise on it. Even just saying that now, my blood pressure went up. And it doesn't mean I'm deranged. It's not Trump derangement syndrome. I think that it's an intelligent revulsion. But now a lot of people on the right think of me as this frothing baby. And they thought that I was more with them than I am because I'm seen as the black person who maybe is not conservative, but who is not woke crazy. So now I'm getting it from both sides, which means that I guess I'm doing something right.
Well, certainly in terms that's an interesting point. It's worth wondering whether or not your reputation is more secure under a Trump administration than it would have been under a Harris administration, in the sense that you would have been co-opted more by the right, and you would have kept banging on about the craziness of the left, and you would have become more perceived as being partisan.
Yeah, I've actually thought of that.
Yeah.
So, that is the weirdness of my situation these days. But, what's important is that I have a situation, and I didn't expect to have one 25 years ago, but here it is.
How long will it be before an artificial intelligence can write your New York Times column to your satisfaction?
Don't tell anybody, but it can already do it.
Can it?
Because actually, I was, this is like name drop. I happened to be sitting at a table with Bill Gates a couple years ago, and he was showing me the latest iteration of his. And he put in, write an editorial by John McWhorter about slavery reparations. And he went, boop. And it spat out this thing that sounded just like me. It had my turns of phrase. It had my take on it. And then it was, what was it after that? Oh, and then translated into Russian. And it did. And my lady, who was Russian, read it. And I said, first of all, is it good Russian? And she said, yes. And she said, it also sounds like you would sound in Russian.
Get out. What does that even mean?
It's so, frankly, it's at the point where I could say, like, for example, take the Palestinian who has been disappeared by the Trump administration. I need to write something about that. And it occurred to me yesterday, technically, I wonder what would happen if I just AI'd it and just put it in. And I'm not going to do that. But it's getting to the point where if you're going to write an editorial that's less than creative, basically AI could do it for you. AI could write an editorial by me about racial preferences now at this point.
What's going to happen when you die to you?
But I don't intend to die. No, I'm one of those people. No, that idea that you allow yourself to decay and all of a sudden,
I don't think there's any allowing going on. I think you're getting drowned. I think it's getting gotten. You're getting gotten.
I do not intend to allow it. And to the extent that that doesn't make sense, and I know that one could argue that it doesn't make sense given that everybody has always died, I wonder if, especially with AI, with new technology, it will allow somebody my age to last a little longer. I'm thinking in terms of being able to make organs and reproduce.
It's not going to be forever, John.
And also, whatever they come up with is probably not going to work on people past a certain age. And why would you want to live longer than a certain period anyway?
Someday, the Grim Reaper is coming for you. What happens the day after that?
I don't want that because I'm never going to be finished. Honestly, I feel like right now at 59, I'm about to be 60. I'm working on a third act. There's some things that I want to do differently. I want to maybe start a cabaret piano career now that I'm old enough that it won't look stupid to do it.
I love it.
And, if things start slowing down when I'm about 125, well, that'll be a lifelong.
Why are you being so evasive about your spiritual intuitions?
I am. Well, for one thing, I'm an atheist, and so I don't think I'm going to be in someone's arms. And I've always feared not only death, but aging. Even at like 10, I thought, I don't want that. Watching people's hair changing color and people bending over in the canes and the hospital stays. I always thought, I don't want that. I have never spent a night in the hospital yet, for example. And if I did, I've told people, just shoot me, just kill me. It's going to be longer than one night. And so I really have an issue.
This is the Ezekiel Emanuel theory of growing old. You remember he wrote so he was instrumental in the Obama administration and the introduction of Obamacare, and he wrote this famous editorial in I think the Atlantic saying that when I'm 70 or 75, I'm just going to not take any. He said I'm going to disavow all medical, even antibiotics or anything like that. I'm going to have any medical intervention whatsoever, and I'm just going to allow nature to take its course after 75.
Oh, no. There's too much to do. And also here's something. I had kids late-ish, and so mine are 10 and 13. If I'm going to see grandkids, I've got to take care of myself to at least get a peek at them. But no, the truth is, I must admit, I've written 24 books. Gets to the point where you've written enough books. Like, I'm not going to be Isaac Asimov. I'm not going to write 50 books because then you start repeating yourself. Yeah, after a while you've done it, but I don't want to admit it. And so let's wait until after Act 3.
I hope you haven't done it. I think you're what's the cunt that we're talking about? What's the phrase about being a great cunt that you were saying? What do the kids talk about these days?
Oh, slaying cunt.
Oh, you're a slaying cunt. So I think you should continue being a slaying cunt for at least another 50 years. John, thank you.
I hope so. Thank you, Josh.